In this sequence of videos, we're going to talk about interpretability and explainability. So if you remember, one of our goals in this class is to be able to make decisions under uncertainty, right? We don't just do data science for the sake of like, oh, this is an interesting thing. Let me just like run this cell of code for the sake of running it. We do it because we want to make some kind of decision in the real world, right? So if we're trying to make decisions in the real world, then we need to be able to say, okay, I have some technique, algorithm, model that I've developed, and now I want to take that and make a decision with it. Well, if I'm going to make a decision, sometimes I need to know, why did it make that prediction? Why did it behave this way? And we've been answering these kinds of questions a lot in the class so far. We've been talking about understanding the why Bayesian models work the way they do. We've been interpreting the coefficients in GLMs. We've been asking these sort of like why, what's going on questions with causal inference. And so this idea should not be entirely unfamiliar to you now that we're here. So what are we going to do in the next few videos? Well, we're going to start by talking about why should we even care about interpretability? Why does it matter? Get a little more tangible into some cases where it really matters. And then we'll say, well, are there cases where maybe it doesn't matter as much? And really understanding the difference between the two. Then we're going to talk about some motivations and definitions. So we're going to say, well, when we ask for interpretability, what should we be trying to get out of it? And then we'll say, well, what even is interpretability? And we'll look at a few different ways to define it. Not necessarily to get like a comprehensive, this is the one definition, but more to get a flavor of here are the things we could define. This is an active area of research. There's a lot that's like still happening, still changing. This is more to give you a flavor of like what are the different ways that people are thinking about these kinds of questions. Then we're going to get a little more concrete. We're going to talk about how do we interpret some parametric and non-parametric models that we've kind of seen and are familiar with. Things like, GLMs, logistic regression, decision trees, the kind of models that lend themselves well to being interpreted. And we'll get a little more concrete in that. And some of this will be new, some of this will be old, some of it will be new. And then finally, we'll get to how do we explain more kind of opaque models that it's harder to examine the internals of what's going on. We talked about with the random forest, well, it's impossible, it's very hard to kind of hold in your mind impossible to hold all of these 100 different trees and what each one is doing and like how when they average together. And so is there a way we can still explain what's going on even in more complex models like a random forest or a neural network? Hope you enjoy. In this video, we're going to talk about why interpretability and explainability matter. And so remember, we said last time that algorithms, data science, analysis, models are being used to make decisions in the real world. And in many cases, those decisions are impacting real people's lives, right? And so, maybe this is a medical, making a medical prediction where you have a, doctor who's studying a disease and you have an algorithm that predicts does somebody have this disease from other information in their medical chart. Well, in that case, if the algorithm predicts a disease and there's some extensive treatment, the doctor wants to know, well, why did it make that prediction? Like, what about this person's medical data makes you think that they have this? And so in that case, the decision, it's really important that the algorithm, the result of the model is transparent to a human, in this case, the doctor. Another example people use a lot in the literature on interpretability, explainability is credit scores and fairness. Is credit scores, right? People talk about, well, if you have an algorithm that predicts whether or not somebody should get a loan or what somebody's credit score is, then you sure want that to be interpretable and explainable, right? You want to know, well, is this decision reasonable? Is it based on something sound or not? And the last example is predicting recidivism, which is predicting whether somebody will commit another crime. Leaving aside the question of whether this is even something you can predict or we should be trying to predict, there are algorithms out there that are being used by cities, by police departments. The most prominent one is called Compass. There's a link in the slides to more on it on the algorithm, on a ProPublic article about how its decisions are racially biased. So these techniques are being used And we often, in many cases where the decisions affect people, right, where there's sort of these high stakes decisions that have an impact on people's lives, we need to be able to explain what's going on. Why did this, person get classified this way? Why did this person get denied the loan? And in fact, some regulations like the big privacy legislation, the GDPR in the European Union, actually requires that certain decisions made by algorithms provide explanations, right? So you have the right to request an explanation for some algorithmic decision that was made on your behalf. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to talk about, kind of make this a little more concrete. This is kind of very abstract. We'll talk about like, what is interpretability? What should we get out of it? And make this a little more concrete. In this video, we're going to talk about some definitions on like, what is interpretability? Like, what do we want to get when we try to do interpretations and explanations? And the content from this video is based on this paper, The Mythos of Model Interpretability by Zach Lipton. It's a kind of one of the foundational papers in the field. People use it. It's certainly not the only way to go about defining these things. It's entirely possible in 5 years that we'll have more refined definitions. But this is meant to give you a flavor of what are the kinds of big picture questions that people are asking when they ask for interpretability. So we'll start by talking about like, what do we even want to get out of it? And then we'll talk about like what it even is. And when we talk about what it is, there's kind of two different ways of looking at it. One is transparency, like understanding the actual model and like what's going on. Another view is just like explanation, right? Once you have the model, you have a prediction, and then how do you actually explain, well, like, okay, why did it make this prediction? And we'll make that a little more concrete when we get there. Okay, so interpretability. What are we trying to get out of it, right? What are the like desiderata out of interpretability? Here are 5. These are certainly not the only 5 that you can think of. There's probably more. And in some cases, you may be interested in some and not others. But let's kind of walk through what these are. First is, why do we want to do this interpretability stuff? We want to be able to trust, right? We want to trust that, if I have some model that makes some predictions and presumably maybe even like impacts, humans, then I want to trust that the model is going to do well, right? That it's going to be accurate, that, it's going to, continue to be accurate in the future. I might want to infer causality, right? We talked a lot about this previously in the class, where we want to not just say, okay, like, here's some model that has predictive accuracy, right? Like here's, if somebody gets the vaccine, I can predict what the probability of them getting disease is. Prediction alone is not enough. I need to know whether the vaccine causes immunity, right? Does the vaccine cause a decrease in the probability of getting a disease? And if it does, then we can say that, great, then we should do this. If not, then, well, maybe there's a confounding variable, and that's actually what's causing it. So a lot of times when people talk about interpretability, they talk about causality as well. We won't spend too much time on this today because we've spent a lot of time on this previously in the class. Another idea is transferability, right? When we ask, like, tell me what's going on with this model, we're really asking, well, okay, like, you did well on this training data set, but when you go and use this model in the real world, the data is not always going to look just like the training set, right? It may see new data, the world may change. And so you want to get a sense of, is this model going to do well in the real world, right? Is this model going to make predictions? And by interpreting it, by seeing, aha, yes, it's learned that, a LED light bulb has a higher probability of lasting longer. And so the model has learned that if it's an LED, then the lifetime should be increased as opposed to decreased. Then that's like a good thing for prediction. Informativeness. A lot of predictions are being used, to help humans, not just to say, well, here's this prediction from the model, and that's the decision that gets made in the real world. It's here's the prediction from this model, it gets looked at by an expert. And you can think of a medical example where a doctor uses the result of some algorithm that like looks at somebody's medical chart and predicts something and says, aha, like, based on this prediction and my domain knowledge as a doctor, I think, we should do this such and such treatment for this patient. And in those cases, it's important that the doctor be able to say, well, okay, why did this, technique make this decision? Why was this the particular decision that was made? Can I understand what's going on? Can you tell me a little more about why this happened? And last but definitely not least is fair and ethical decision making, right? A lot of times we want to know, is the result from, is this model, is this technique biased? Does it has it incorporated racism, sexism, other kinds of bigotry into the inner workings of the model? And so you can imagine that this is a very, very important question. Today, a lot of algorithms are being used in situations where there's historically been a lot of discrimination. Some of the examples I mentioned last time, like predicting whether or not somebody should get a loan, predicting recidivism. These are areas where the sort of racism in society has had a huge impact on people in the past. And it's important to say, well, if we're going to use algorithms to help us do this, we sure don't want to perpetuate those biases. Now, whether or not that's possible, it's another question. We'll talk about a little bit about that later. Okay, so this is like the kind of like, what are we trying to get out of interpretability? And then there's two different ways of looking at it, right? There's like the transparency angle, and then there's like the explanations angle. So transparency is like, can I understand like the actual mechanics of like what the model is doing, right? There's sort of like a few different layers, and Lipton has like these kind of words for these, but at one level, there's like, can I understand the entire model? Can I hold the whole thing in my head? And you can imagine like a short, decision tree, maybe like 2 or 3 layers. I can like look at an image of it, and we'll actually look at an image a little later, and I can say, yes, I know exactly what's going on. This makes sense. I can understand the whole decision. Now you can imagine a much bigger decision tree, with like 100 features, 200 layers deep. Well, it's a lot harder to understand the entire model, right? It's a lot harder to say, well, I can, just sort of like hold the whole decision, like if this is greater than this, and this is between this and this, and this is between that, and if this one changes to that, then it sort of gets a little too much to hold in your head. But in those cases, you can at least understand the individual components of the model, right? You can say, well, I can understand like, that this top of the tree is kind of like, filtering out this data set and like filtering out this feature, and then like this part is doing this. And so you can understand the individual components, even if you can't necessarily hold the whole thing in your mind. And there's sort of like a hierarchy, right? And then of like, can you understand the whole thing? Can you understand the components? Then there's this idea of algorithmic transparency, right? How does the algorithm work? Are there any theoretical guarantees, right? If you think about the algorithms for bandits that we learned last week, a lot of those come with great guarantees on the regret, right? If you use the UCB algorithm, you're guaranteed to have logarithmic regret. That's kind of nice, right? You can say, okay, this algorithm is guaranteed to, only do this badly in the long run. If you use a random forest, there are a lot fewer theoretical guarantees. The theory around random forests is not nearly as well developed as a lot of the other methods. And so in that case, maybe you don't trust the model as much. So this is kind of 3 different ways of looking at it. They're certainly not the only 3. But these are 3 that people are thinking about a lot. Okay, another way of thinking about it is, okay, like maybe I can't understand the model, but I want to understand its individual decisions and predictions that it's made. And this is kind of a post hoc way of thinking about it. Post hoc is Latin for like after the fact, I think. It's basically saying, okay, the model made some prediction. Now, why did it make this specific prediction, right? This specific person was predicted that they'll default on the loan, so we should deny them the loan. Well, why did you predict that for that person? Like, what about that? What about that person? Why did you do this? Understanding like the actual individual predictions. So there's sort of this idea of local explanations, which is why this specific prediction, why like for maybe I can't understand the whole model, but I can understand this like one specific prediction, right? I can say, aha, for this, this like there's this huge decision tree. I can't hold the whole thing, but I can say, okay, for this one person, they like went down this path and then like this way and that way and like this, aha, and like I can kind of pick out that like it's kind of filtering out, their credit history or the neighborhood that they're trying to buy the house in, and so on and so on. There's also explanation by examples, right? We saw this with nearest neighbors. Can you show me? It's like, can you show me similar examples? Right? This is sort of the human equivalent of like the human thing of, well, when you made this decision, can you give me an analogy? This person is like this other person, and that person was denied a loan by the bank manager, and so I made the decision here. In a lot of cases, that can be a little less satisfying. It's like, well, why was that person denied a loan by the bank manager? That's a whole nother question, right? But it's like, well, this person was like these other people that you told me in the training set had this thing. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of like what we might want to get out of interpretability. It's certainly not the only one. This is an active area of research, but this is meant to just give you an idea of a flavor of sometimes we want to look at the model, sometimes we want to look at the actual predictions. Why do we care about this? We care about this because we want to trust that our models are going to do well. We want to trust that they'll generalize. We want to know that they're being fair. We want to maybe sometimes understand causal relationships. In this video, we're going to talk about how we interpret parametric models. And we're going to kind of focus our attention on generalized linear models, specifically logistic regression. But we'll see that a lot of the ideas apply to other kind of methods as well. As long as we know the parameters, as long as we have a story about here's how we go from the data to the parameters, here's how we get our predictions, then we can use this kind of technique to interpret what's going on. And to kind of put this in perspective, this kind of interpretability is more along the lines of what Lipton calls being able to like have a model be transparent and understand the entire model. Okay, so I have the same data set from last time, and it's this sort of checkerboard pattern data set where we have a bunch of ones, a bunch of zeros, and we know that a linear model does not do a good job of classifying this, right? We saw we needed a decision tree. So quick recap on logistic regression. So we're trying to predict y from x. In this case, y is these labels 0, 1, x1 and x2 are these variables. In the training data, they go from -1 to 1. And p is the probability that y is 1. And the logistic regression says we predict p as the sigmoid of this linear function of x1 and x2, right? So again, the linearity here is in how we're combining the x's. And we can see that in this case, if we take the inverse sigmoid on both sides, the inverse of the sigmoid is the logit function, which is like log p over 1 minus p. And this quantity is called the log odds. And you can see that like the bigger this gets, then, as p gets bigger, this gets bigger. As p gets closer to 0, this gets smaller. And this gets more and more negative. And so now we can look at this equation and interpret it as beta 1 tells us what is the contribution of x1 to the log odds, right? As for every unit increase in x1, what is the corresponding increase in the log odds of y? So, we fit a logistic regression model, and this is what we got, right? Pretty poor performance, but let's try to interpret what's going on here. And so if we try to interpret this, we can see, well, it looks like the model kind of predicts that as x2 increases, then your probability goes up, right? Just like looking at the graph, I'm seeing, and knowing that it's linear, it's like, well, as x2 increases, the probability goes up. And there's kind of an increase as x1 increases too, right? Like if I kind of look at this line from like up here, we can see that over on the left side, x1 is negative, and the probability is like, this is like green, so that's, I don't know, like 0.8. And then as we go to the right, then it gets closer to yellow, so this is like 0.95. So as x1 increases, probability goes up. As x2 increases, probability goes up. But x2 kind of has a bigger impact on the predicted probabilities, right? As x2 increases, the probability goes all the way from like 0.1 to 0.9, whereas as x1 increases, it only goes up by like 0.1-ish. Okay, so this is great if we have only 2 variables and we can just like inspect our linear model. I figured this out visually. But what if we have a lot more models, or a lot more features, right? We have a lot, not just 2 features, but maybe 10 features, and we want to know what is the contribution that logistic regression assigns to each one of them. And so what we can do is, remember, we did this code by using scikit-learn's logistic regression model. And so we have this model logistic object. Oops. And we can look at it. It's a logistic regression. And what we can do is we can actually say model logistic dot coef underscore. And this gives me the coefficients of the model. And now I can see that, the coefficients are 0.146 and 0.806, right? So it's like 0.1 and 0.8, right? And so this corresponds to what we got out of the graph, right? So by looking at these coefficients, we can see, the model predicts that as for every unit increase in x1, then the log odds goes up by 0.8, right? And so if somebody asks you, hey, what does this model think? Like, is x1 more important or is x2 more important? Well, in this case, they're on the same scale, so you can compare them and you can say, well, as x2 increases, prediction goes up by a lot, but as x1 increases, it only goes up by a little. And maybe if one of these were negative, then we can say one of them has a negative impact. Now, okay, so that's how we interpret it, but I want to highlight something, which is that this is interpreting the results of the model, right? So our interpretation is only good in as much as it's interpreting this graph. But this graph is not what's going on in our real data, right? If I scroll back up, this is what's going on in our real data. And logistic regression was a very poor fit to the real data. And so that means that I can do all the interpretation that I want, but if that interpretation, is not being done on a model that has good accuracy, it's not really that useful. So this would be great, if the model had worked. This is how you'd look at the coefficients, and you'll get a little more practice doing this on the lab. So now let's talk about how we interpret non-parametric methods. So let's think about, we're going to do k-nearest neighbors classifiers, and we're also going to do decision trees. And we're going to kind of like briefly touch on random forest, but we'll get more of that next time, next video. So let's start with KNN. So, this is the same code from the demo last time. We fit a KNN classifier with k equals 3 to our checkerboard data, and we get these predictions out, right? And so we can see that over here, the points are kind of misclassified, but generally it does a pretty good job. So we might want to ask, hey, why are some of these points misclassified? Like, for example, this one, these 2 points over here, they're what, like x1 is negative, I don't know, like 1/3-ish, because this is -1. So like x1 is -1/3, x2 is like -2.5 or so. Why was this point classified as 0 instead of a 1? We know that that's a mistake, so maybe we might want to ask, why did that go wrong? Well, k-nearest neighbor can tell us, okay, just go look at the training data and find the nearest points. And in practice, if there's in higher dimensions, we probably actually write code to do this. But we can, in this case, just go visually inspect the training data and see that if we have a point over there, which is like -2.5, which on this graph, if I comment this out, right? Like on this graph, if the point -2.5, 1/3 is probably like somewhere around here, then why was that point classified as a 0 instead of 1? We can see that, if we have a point here, if we have a point that's that lives over here, or this x is, it's closer to these points than it is to this point, right? And maybe it's actually closer to that one, but it's closer to these than it is to any of the ones. And so that's why this point gets classified as a 0, is because it's closer to these points. In our training data set, you can see that it just so happened that the zeros, the purples, go all the way down, whereas we happen to not get any ones in our training set with like very low values of x2. And that kind of leads to the errors that we see. Okay, so that's how one thing we can ask from k-nearest neighbors. And this kind of falls under the like explanation by example, right? Maybe I can't, fully understand like exactly, what exactly is going on in the whole model because, it's comparing against every single point here. But I can ask for any particular, prediction that gets made, right? Like from this particular prediction on this particular point, why did you do that? Why did k-nearest neighbor say that this was a 0? And we can get an answer with explanation by example. Sometimes that may be, valuable. Sometimes it may be helpful to say, aha, this person is like these other people. in a medical case, then maybe that means we should study what happened with those people and generalize to this person. In other cases, maybe it doesn't actually help because we don't know, okay, just because it's like those people, we want to understand something more fundamental. So whether or not it's useful really depends on your application. So now let's think about decision trees. So we can look at a decision tree. So this code here is, again, from last time, training a decision tree classifier on the checkerboard data. And we can see that, it does a pretty good job. It's not perfect. There's a few mistakes here and there, but accuracy on the training set is 99.6%. So we said that with decision trees, we can inspect the actual tree and understand what's going on. And so scikit-learn actually has a function that makes it easy for us to do this. It's called plot tree. It requires a little bit of finagling with the size of the figure and the font, and you have to give it the names of your features, in this case, x1 and x2, so that it knows what they are. And we can do this and it'll draw the tree for us. So this is our decision tree. Remember the one that we came up with when we did this last time was only a couple layers deep? We can see that this is a little deeper than that, which is probably why the accuracy is only 99.6 and not 100. So what's it doing? Well, the first decision is x2 less than 0.317. And if we go up to the graph, that corresponds to making a split somewhere around here, right? And why does it do this? Because again, remember we said that the first time there's kind of this arbitrary tie, and it probably just happened that the points were they're randomly generated. So there were randomly enough points that this happened to be the best split. And we can see that the two splits don't have, it's not a very good split. The value here, so here we can see that there's 57 zeros and 42 ones. Here there's 17 zeros and 32 ones. And the color here corresponds to orange means higher probability of being 0. Blue means higher probability of being 1. But now we can see at these two, it immediately knows, right? The first split was on x2 being not 0, but maybe close to 0. But then it immediately knows, aha, okay, next time the split x1 is at 0, right? It's again, not exactly 0, but it knows that the split is here. And in this case, we're done because the two, for the case where x2 is above 0.317, then that's pretty much a perfect split. For this case, we actually need a little more, and these are just splitting on x2, basically x2 less than 0. And we can see that over here, because of the randomness of the points, we actually keep going. And this is kind of what we saw with decision trees kind of overfitting the data, where it's not just good enough for x1 to be less than 0.03. We need another tree to see whether it's between negative 0.015 and 0.03. Again, this is sort of just the randomness of the data points causing us small problems. But what we can see is that all of our leaf nodes are either bright blue or bright orange. And we can see that they're all either 0, all of 1, none of the other, right? This is 0, no 1s and 31s, or no 0s and 31s, and similarly for all of these. So this is our decision tree. We can look at it, we can inspect it, we can see, hey, this is not quite what I expected, but it's doing something kind of reasonable. Why? And the explanation I just gave you is really a intuitive explanation of aha, because the randomness of the points, right? And why was I able to do that intuitive explanation? Because I was able to look at the entire tree, keep the whole thing in mind at once, and had an understanding of the data, right? So that's what being able to visualize decision trees gives us, right? We can interpret what's going on. We can tell a story about what's happening in the real world. Okay, so now what happens if you have 100 of these trees, right? With a random forest, let's say I trained a random forest and I just plotted out all 100 of the trees. Probably, not really helpful to look at this. If I look at the first one, okay, I can see what's going on. The second one, I can see what's going on. How is that different from the first one? What's going to happen when I average them together? It's really hard to hold all of that in your head. Maybe you can understand parts of the individual piece, but once you start averaging together so many models, it becomes a lot trickier. Same thing with neural nets, right? If you think about a even just a 2-layer neural network with a few features, it gets kind of hard to think about, okay, like I have these combination of weights from the first layer and like these combination of weights from the second layer. I'm like multiplying, then I have this nonlinearity. How exactly does this input affect the output? It's a lot harder to answer questions like that. And so in the next video, we'll talk about ways that people have found to get around that problem. In this video, we're going to talk about how do we get explanations from models that are more complex, more opaque. These models are often called black box models. Nowadays, there's a push to, in an effort to make language more inclusive, people are calling them mystery box models as well. Plus mystery box just sounds more fun, right? So it's like a mystery box, what's inside? Which is exactly the point, that these models, like what's inside may be really complicated. You can imagine a random forest has like 100, if it has 100 trees, it's hard to like really pick apart exactly what each one is doing, how they're combining, and so on. You can imagine in a neural network, we've looked at like simple 2-layer neural networks, but let's say you have like 150 layers, right? Which is what people do in the world of computer vision. It's hard to like really understand, okay, so the first layer is doing this, and the second layer is doing this, and then the third layer is like combining all these things from the second layer and producing all these things. And you can go on and on and on. And it's kind of hard to interpret exactly what's going on. And so that's why there's been a push to make these methods that give you post hoc explanations from models that are more complex, right? So the kind of theme here is post hoc explanations from complex models that maybe don't have an interpretation. And in this case, I'm going to make a distinction between interpretability and explainability. This is not like a well-established distinction, but a bunch of people use it, so we'll use it here. Interpretable models are things like, that we've talked about so far, like linear regression, decision trees, logistic regression, where we can actually interpret what's going on, right? Explainable models are explanations. Maybe the model itself isn't interpretable, but we can explain the predictions, right? So we're coming with explanations for each individual prediction, maybe not all of them, but like specific ones that we care about. And there's kind of two ways that people go about this, and I'll talk a little bit about both of them. But for the sake of time in this class, we'll just focus on one. Okay, so let's think about this ringed data set that we looked at last time, right? It's sort of this like zeros in the middle, ones out here, zeros way out here. And, we saw that like this is kind of a more complex, even more complex data set than the kind of like checkerboard. So what happens if we fit a random forest? So this cell, instantiates a random forest with 100 trees, and all the trees can be, as deep as they need to be. It fits it on X and Y. X is X1 and X2, and then we predict the probabilities and draw them. So if we run this cell, we can see that these are the predictions. Now this is a little unfair because these are the predictions on the training set, but for now, this will serve our purposes of trying to understand what's going on. So let's suppose that I'm interested in this particular point, right? Why is this particular point have a relatively, like it looks like the probability is, I don't know, like greenish, so it's like somewhere close to a half. Why does this point have a probability close to 0.5? What's going on with this model that gives this point such a low probability? And there's a family of methods called local surrogate methods, where just a really fancy name for saying, okay, to understand the prediction of this like complicated random forest at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to like zoom in really close to that point. So let's actually zoom in. And this is the point we're interested in. And close to this point, we'll say, hey, look, this decision boundary looks a lot simpler, like, zoomed in than it did from far away, right? Over here, it almost kind of looks like we could draw a line, right? Like if I draw a line right here, or maybe like right here, you can tell my drawing, like somewhere around here, right? If I draw one of these 3 lines, that line should be a pretty good decision boundary for distinguishing yellow from purple around this point, right? At least according to the random forest. And so what this family of methods says is, okay, if you want to explain a particular prediction, in this case, this point right here, then what we do is we say, zoom in and fit a linear model based on a linear or other simple model based on what's going on around this point. So we'll only consider points that are nearby. And a lot of times we'll actually do weighting, where we'll do like a weighted linear regression or something where we weight points by how close they are to the point we're interested in. We'll fit that model and then we can explain it. And so what does that look like here? It looks like saying, well, close to this point, the value of x1 doesn't seem to matter, right? It's maybe like there's a slight trend as you go further from left to right, right? You're more likely to get more, like as you go from like left to right, you're more likely to get more negative values, but it's not much of an impact. Whereas x2 here has a really big impact, right? If you increase x2, then somewhere around here, there's a switch from points being labeled as 1 to points being labeled as 0. And it's important to keep in mind, we're not fitting the original labels. We're fitting the model to the predictions from the more complex model. So we're kind of using the more complex model as a guide in this space. And so we're fitting a simple model to explain the complex model. And then we're saying, okay, can we interpret the simple model and generalize those interpretations to the more complex one? And that's exactly the story that I just told you, right? I told you, looking at this, thinking about this as a linear model, then there's some, like big coefficient on x2, right? I guess it's a big negative coefficient on x2 because the probability goes down as x2 increases. And there's kind of a very small coefficient on x1. Not maybe it's positive, maybe it's negative, but it's either way, it's like very close to 0, right? And so boom, that's the simple linear model that I fit. And so close to this point, I can explain what's going on. I can say x2 is important, x1 is not, right? And as another example, let's say I zoom back out, and let's say I want to understand what's going on with this point right here. So again, I will zoom in, and close to this this point, which is the one I'm interested in, again, I can say, okay, let's think about the predictions of the random forest, and let's do a line. I'll actually use the line drawing tool. The decision boundary is probably like something like this, right? So over here, the contribution is equal from so as we go from x1 goes from left to right, the values go down. So the coefficient on x1 is negative. As the values go x2 to x2 go negative, small to big, the values go up. So coefficient on x2 is positive. So we can see that, in this case, the linear model tells a very different story. So how does this method, taking a step back, this approach is used by a few different methods. It was pioneered in this method called LINE, which is local, interpretable, model agnostic explanations. This works for any model, right? I mean, I use a random forest, but this idea of like zoom in, fit a line or other simple model, and interpret the line is applicable to any model. I did it with a random forest. I could have done it with a neural network. I could have done it with any model. And as long as that simple model is reasonably close to what the complex model says, right? Like in this case, the simple model seems to do a good job of explaining things over here, but maybe it doesn't do such a good job of explaining things over here because I got some purples on this yellow side of the line, right? So as long as this simple model does a good job of approximating the more complex one, then these methods work pretty well. If they don't, then maybe not so much. So this is an active area of research. As I mentioned, there's LINE, which is kind of the one of the original methods to do this. It's widely used. You'll play around with it a little on the lab. There's another family of methods that say, okay, how do we measure which features are important? And they're called permutation-based methods that say, well, okay, let's fit a model without this feature. Like let's say I have x1 through x10. Let's fit a model on just x1 through x9. See how well that does. Then I'll fit maybe just a model on x1 through x8 and x10. See how well that one does and repeat. And then that gives you a sense of how much each feature contributes to the answer. That's another family of methods. We won't be going too much into it in this class, but it's important to know. We'll add some links to further resources in the reading. Okay, so in the next video, we'll kind of like summarize, wrap up, and talk about some pitfalls. But before we go into kind of the nitty gritty of like how do we actually get interpretations out of our models and techniques, I want to talk a little bit about going beyond interpretability, right? So interpretability is great, but in some of these cases that examples I've talked about, predicting recidivism, granting loans, medical decisions, there are questions beyond just like, okay, here's this algorithm, here's the decision, tell me why it made that decision. There's bigger questions than that, right? It's, should we even be making this decision in the first place, right? Like, is it even like a well-formulated problem to say, well, I want an algorithm to predict whether somebody's going to, commit another crime. Well, if you think about like the racist history of policing, is it really possible to do that well? Is that even something we should train an algorithm to predict? And there's some other things that like it's probably not a good idea to train models to predict. Some of the original statisticians were also into phrenology, which was like trying to predict somebody's intelligence by like from the shape of their skull. And this sounds really silly to us today, but there are companies that are trying to do exactly this, right? Like trying to predict from the shape of somebody's face, how trustworthy they are. This is an actual paper that came out, I think last year, maybe this year, very controversial, for obvious reasons. A lot of people very rightfully saying this is not a good idea. But with some of these decisions, people ask, well, okay, can an algorithm make decisions free from bias? But then there's a question of, well, what's the status quo, right? The status quo is maybe a judge making the decision about whether or not this person is likely to commit another crime. Like there's a proposition in California last year about whether we should replace cash bail with predictive algorithms. And so, there's these questions about, well, is the system that these algorithms would be replacing worse, better? Can an algorithm make a better decision than a human? These are not questions that I can answer in the span of a 5-minute video. They're not really even questions I can answer in the span of a 1-semester class. This is a huge, huge, huge topic. There's an excellent free online textbook linked in the slides. Highly encourage you to check it out. Co-authored in part by Berkeley professor and former Data 102 instructor, Professor Maurice Hart. It's a work in progress. This is an active area of research. There's a lot of people working on this. One thing that, if you take anything away from this, please take away that when you make these decisions about using data science, we want you to, we give you the tools in Data 102 to bring your technical knowledge, to understand, okay, what's going on here? Like, why is this technique doing this? Why is this analysis this way? What's going on in the data? But it's important to also bring your ethics and your values, right? And so this is not necessarily the subject of this course, but it's important whenever you're saying, when you're asked to build some algorithm, think about, is it a good idea? Is this consistent with my ethics and my values to build this, to do this? And evaluate things, not just, here's this interesting problem, but think about it more holistically. Okay, obviously, I could talk about this for hours, but we should move on to talking about really concretely, how do we do interpretability?